There's been a mystery floating around the Alan Wake community since players first got to the end of episode 5. Did Alan create Tom the Poet, or did Tom the Poet create Alan? Thanks to some things from Alan Wake 2, it got me thinking. I started putting the pieces together and I think I figured out who made who. But also, I think I figured out why everything in the Remedyverse is happening. Okay, things may have spiraled out of control. All of this was needed for me to figure out the most outer section of the spiral. One thing led to another, which led to another, which led to another, which led to another, which led to another, and I went a little crazy. But it takes crazy to know crazy. Wait. Crazy person said that. So here's the plan. We're going to go to the scene at the very end of the spiral that started it all and work our way in step by step until we get to the center of this crazy ocean I discovered. The clicker is a plot device given to Alan by his mother. It's a light switch that can chase away the darkness and amplify the reality changing effects of the dark place. Wake gave it to his wife Alice one night when the power went out and told her the story of his mom giving it to him. Fast forward to the end of chapter 5 in Alan Wake 1 and we see that the clicker is here in Bright Falls in a shoebox and not with Alice. With it, there's a poem by a Thomas Zane detailing the night that Alan's mother gave him the clicker and saying that he will use it to defeat the darkness, which he does. Alan uses the clicker to defeat the darkness and save the day at the end of Alan Wake 1. But that poem leads to why we have this mystery of who created who. This whole series is about art manipulating reality. So if the poem details Alan's key backstory and how he will defeat the darkness, does that mean Alan Wake's whole life is just a product of Tom the Poet's writing? But Alan only found the poem and the clicker here because he wrote it into Departure, the story that the game is following. That means Alan must have made up Tom the Poet then, right? This is all circular logic that brings us to the next point in the spiral. We have two options for who made who, and it's the two options people have been debating since the first game came out. Either the poet wrote Alan into reality to defeat the darkness, or Alan wrote the poet into reality so he can give the clicker power, bring it to Bright Falls so Alan can use it to defeat the darkness. Personally, I believe Alan Wake made Tom the Poet real. And to explain why the poet couldn't have been the one to create Alan, we need to go to the whiteboard. Here's the issue with Tom the Poet creating Alan. If he did, we have looping logic that I can't see a clear way out of, and we end up trapped in the debate we've had since 2010. Starting from if the poet used the poem to create Alan, in the poem he puts the clicker in Alan's life, gives it power, sets him on the path to end up here, where he finds it and uses it to defeat the darkness. But on that path, Alan interacts with the darkness, writes Departure, which has a scene of him reading the poem. If Alan wrote in that he reads the poem, that must mean Alan created the poet because he wrote in the poem. But in that poem, he puts the clicker in Alan's life, gives it power, sets him on this path to end up here, where he finds it and uses it to defeat the darkness. So the poet uses the poem to create Alan, if all of that came true. But on that path, Alan interacts with the darkness, he writes Departure, which has a scene of him reading the poem. If Alan wrote in that he reads the poem, that must mean Alan created the poet because he wrote in the poem. It's a loop. It's a loop. I'm looping. I'm looping. But it's not a loop. It's a spiral. I'm spiraling. Trapped in a lake. But it's not a lake. It's an ocean of darkness within the lake. Tom the Poet, the diver, the one we see during Alan Wake, was brought into reality by Wake. Why? Because there can't be any circular looping logic in this series. Not because of any rules of storytelling saying that's a bad thing. It's because of the final line in Alan Wake 2's base game.
It's not a loop. It's a spiral.
Every line in Remedy's games are written for a reason. Nothing's said for the hell of it, especially with an ending line. So with only context from the first game, yes, this logic can loop. So with the sequel telling us that nothing is truly looping, it may seem like it is, but it's not. Along with giving us more evidence on this whole mess, I believe if the poet makes Wake, it's a loop. And if Wake makes the poet, it's a spiral. So Alan made the poet. It's as simple as that. But the dark place can't create something out of nothing. Which brings us to the next section. During the AWE DLC In Control, we meet the real Tom Zane for the first time, and he says this.
Tom, the poet. A diver, you look different.
That was just a role, a character. The protagonist I played in my old film. I'm a filmmaker. An auteur like yourself.
During the dream in Alan Wake Remastered's opening, we see this poster. That same poster can be found in Alan Wake 2. Naturally, all this means that the real Tom Zane made a movie called Tom the Poet. But wait, hold up. Look at the bottom of the poster. I had to rewrite this section when I noticed that tiny little bit that said based on a novel by Alan Wake. That was the first thing I ran into while writing all of this that stumped me. With the rest of the theory I constructed, it created a loop. I see 3 options for this line at the bottom of the poster, going from least likely to most likely. It's just a lie, a red herring. I don't think that's the case because Remedy is very deliberate with things. To be fair, there is stuff from Alan Wake 1 that muddies the water for this whole series and that could influence this a bit. They may not have planned the path that we're currently on back in 2010. I think they started planning it in 2012, which is why the movie poster isn't in the original game. It was added in the remaster. Again, that scene in Control is the first time we hear about Tom being a filmmaker. 2, the book that the movie is based off of is Departure by Alan Wake. That's where the loop comes in because I was operating under the assumption that Alan saw Tom the Poet before writing Departure, so he used that as backstory for his book. But if he wrote the book that the movie is based off of, how could he have used that as the backstory for his book? That's not possible with how time works in the real world. If the movie is based off of Departure, it loops. All of this is assuming that Zane made Tom the Poet in the real world and not in the dark place. And I believe he made it in the real world. The third and most likely option, considering there are other characters who are real people and not actors on that poster, I think it's just the devs' way of saying that everything we see of Tom the Poet in Alan Wake 1 was written by Alan Wake. With all that being said, something similar to the movie and the backstory that Alan wrote in Alan Wake 1 happened to the real Tom Zane. Behind Darling in one of Final Draft Mode's videos, there's a bunch of years that line up when different AWEs happened in Cauldron Lake. One of those is the same year that the poet encountered the darkness. On top of that, we have the This House of Dreams blog by one Samantha Wells. In one of the many posts, she details a dream she had. In it, there's a diver, and he tells her what happened to himself and his love. There's a lot of stuff in this blog, like a lot. Shoutouts to an old ARG, I guess. She writes about one dream where she talked to an FBC agent, where they drop the term AWE. In another, she talks to Alan. Between the blog and the whiteboard behind Darling, we have hard evidence that what happened to Tom the Poet happened to the real Tom Zane in the same year. To summarize before moving on, this isn't the real poster for Tom the Poet, the movie. It is a real movie. It does exist. The poster is here to confirm that Alan wrote the poet into reality for Alan Wake 1, which means everything in Alan Wake 1 was written by Alan Wake. None of it came from Tom the Poet because he is a movie character created by Tom Zane, the filmmaker. The poet and the poem were brought into the story by Alan to give the clicker power and to bring it to Bright Falls. The role of Tom in Alan Wake 1 was played by the Bright Presence, which is why he has a different voice than the real Tom. And Alan wrote in that the poet wrote himself out of reality. That's why everyone in Bright Falls doesn't know he's a filmmaker. They only know the character that he brought in for the story. Don't worry, we will see more of the real Tom Zane soon, but that is deeper down the spiral. There are 2 other artists who could create a loop that I need to address now. It's time for the first section on the old gods of Asgard. Thor and Odin Anderson have encountered supernatural forces a lot over their lifetime. Most importantly, it happened twice in the 70s and once in the 80s. I believe the darkness tried its darndest to get the Anderson brothers to manipulate reality to set it free, but it failed due to a combination of the power that their bloodline has, which is why Saga is able to mentally fight off the darkness in Alan Wake 2, and their role in the bigger story that's causing all of this. Their songs across the 3 Remedyverse games didn't manipulate reality to have those events happen. They are all used to guide characters in their time of need, which is why their power to change reality is very limited. I believe that's a specific reason why Alan wrote them into his stories to have them guide him. In Alan Wake 1, there are 2 songs, Children of the Elder God and Poet and the Muse. The first one guides Alan through a fight and its pyrotechnics help him. I guarantee you all Barry did was hit a play button. The second song guides Alan to Cynthia Weaver so he can get the clicker and reshape destiny, while giving him a lore dump on Tom the Poet. If they changed reality so that one day Alan would end up in this situation where he needed to find the Lady of the Light, that would create another loop. Don't worry, I will get to how these songs are able to tell the future. In American Nightmare, the standalone DLC nobody talks about, Balance Slays the Demon is the only song we got, and it guides him on how to beat his demons. Funny enough, to beat his demon in Alan Wake 2, he does achieve a balance of light and darkness, if you consider absorbing the dark presence and then being shot by a bullet of light balance. But there's an interesting bit at the end of the song. If you play a section backwards, you will hear this. Note that this game came out in 2012, the same day that this House of Dreams blog started. The craziest part about it to me is that they say this before Quantum Break, the game they made before Control. So they must have had Control planned out in 2012 if they were already teasing her hometown. That wouldn't be the only time they sing about a town called Ordinary, because we have Take Control, a song about Jessie's life, and listening to it guides her through the ashtray maze. The best section I've ever played in any action-focused third-person shooter. In Alan Wake 2, they have 3 songs: Dark Ocean Summoning, Anger's Remorse, and Herald of Darkness. The first one guides Alan out of the dark place and back to the real world. The second one is a key to an overlap. Playing it is a part of the ritual. It guides Saga into that overlap. The third one guides Alan through his musical. They're literally pointing in the direction that Alan needs to go in this section, so it's not limited to their music. From this angle, everything that the old gods wrote wasn't made into reality. The only real reality altering we see from them is Dark Ocean summoning Alan from a dark ocean, but that only really happened because of the clicker, something the Andersons describe as an amp. They're not able to manipulate any reality on their own, especially because Herald of Darkness would have created another loop because Alan helped with it. A really messed up loop because Alan would then be responsible for everything that happened to him since the day he was born. Their role in the spiral is to guide. Every aspect of them in these stories serve that very purpose. Alan brings them in to guide him, they guide Jessie, and they guide Saga. But they cannot change the future they're forced to write about. All they can do is sing about what's going to happen and guide people. Again, Dark Ocean Summoning is the only time we directly see them changing reality. They know they can't change reality too, which is why these lines in Take Control exist.
I wish I had the wherewithal to find you when I had the chance. Instead I danced with death in fervor skin. I missed the moment before the fall to recognize I had a choice to stop it all from happening. If only I could save you from the pain.
While I have seen interpretations of these lines as coming from Jessie, it's her lamenting about how she could have saved her brother. I think it's the Andersons saying that they maybe could have stopped what happened to her because they knew it was going to happen ahead of time, but they're ultimately powerless to stop it because they agreed to their role in the bigger story. For the most part, the song is from Jessie's POV. The bridge having a different tone signals a POV change for me. Even if I was wrong and that line is from Jessie's POV, I don't think it matters too much. Now here's where we get a little funky with time. How can Poet and the Muse guide Alan if it was written decades before he needed it in Departure? Time doesn't matter in the dark place. I honestly didn't know what photo to put here, although I'm now just realizing I should have put one of those spiral clock photos. That would have been so good. It goes whichever way it wants to, if it even feels like moving. A quick trip to the whiteboard can explain it very easily. Using Saga's section in Alan Wake 2, we have a frame of reference, because it's the only one that operates in a way that we perceive in our world. The first overlap happens, then Wake returns, then the second overlap occurs, followed by the third one. Dark Ocean Summoning is played, then Wake is brought out of the dark place, before he is shot back in time. Looking at Alan's point of view, he's basically going backwards throughout the game's story. They start at the same point during the first overlap, but then his second overlap meeting is the third one, his third one is the second one. Then Dark Ocean Summoning guides him back until he is sent back in time and ends up after the first overlap. I believe this is the best place to establish this. This is why the story of Departure starts to take place the second Alan enters the Bright Falls area. It's because time doesn't matter to the Dark Presence, and he's now in its area of influence. Alan only has that dream and meets Barbara at the start of the game because the story demanded it, despite it happening before the story was written from Alan's perspective. But trust me, this doesn't create a loop. Also keep in mind that Zane and Barbara in Alan Wake 1 aren't the real people. The Bright Presence is playing Zane and the Dark Presence is playing Barbara. So the second that Alan starts that dream in Alan Wake 1, the story is starting to take shape. So if he knew of the real Zane prior, he wouldn't remember him, because when he was writing Departure, he wrote in that Zane wrote himself out of reality. That's also why Barry can't find Tom the filmmaker on Google. Bit of a tangent on how reality altering effects work. Alan needing to be in Bright Falls for Departure to happen isn't what brought him there, because that would cause another loop. If Alan wrote in that he needed to come to Bright Falls, it's only happening because an Alan who is in Bright Falls already wrote it. I believe something else influenced him to go to Bright Falls. And as soon as that influence takes root, Departure, a story that hasn't been written yet from Alan's perspective, can start to take shape. Nothing can stop him from changing past events that do not affect it. Nothing can stop him from ending up in that writer's room. He can only manipulate how he got there, and he did it in a way that satisfied the story. So the Dark Place sent him back in time to before he wrote Departure so he could give himself that dream. Some other funky time shenanigans that he was doing was haunting Alice in the sequel. Whenever he was entering Parliament Plaza, he was shot back in time to before she jumped into the lake to save him. This is also how he was haunting her in American Nightmare. Alan is also the reason why the Andersons wrote Poet and the Muse. One of the interactions that they had with the Dark Presence in the 70s was caused because Alan needed that song. Alan deserves a producer credit on some of their songs. Lastly, something I didn't have room to put up because it's just tile over here. In Alan Wake 2's New Game Plus, Darling confirms that time is weird in the Dark Place. Trust me, it's very important to know that time doesn't work in the Dark Place for the series to happen. Initially, I was just going to use the Jeremy Bearimy gag from The Good Place, but that loops, and as we all know, it's not a loop, it's a spiral. Now we can finally move on from time and to talk about the second full game released in the Remedyverse, Control. There are a few things in Control that are important to this whole thing. First off, Darling is missing. No one knows what happened to him by the end of the game. It is important to mention that he is played by Alan Wake's voice actor. Naturally, they sound alike. I believe that Casper Darling has played a massive role in everything, so it is important to establish now that he's missing. Second, this is when we start to hear about the real Thomas Zane, the filmmaker. There's an audio log of Jessie quoting Tom the Poet to her therapist, and her therapist replies by telling her that he's a filmmaker, not a poet, and he didn't even know it.
You mentioned a poem when we talked. By Thomas Zane?
Yes. Beyond the shadow you settle for, there's a miracle illuminated.
I looked the poem up. Only I couldn't find any poet by that name. I did find a European filmmaker who moved here in the 60s, named Thomas Zane.
What? I don't...
No matter. It suits you very well. The poem. How you see things. Maybe you wrote it yourself?
I didn't.
No matter.
It's important to note that whenever he's mentioned from this point onward, he is a filmmaker, because that's who the real Thomas Zane is. Now that the story of Alan Wake 1 is done, there's no need for the universe to remember him as a poet. It is interesting that Jessie knows about Tom the Poet. I will get to that one a bit later. As I brought up before, in the AWE DLC, we see the real Tom Zane for the first time. I'll skip over the parts of this scene that prove that Tom the Poet and Tom the Filmmaker are two different people, because you already know that if you've been able to follow along over the last 15-20 minutes. What is super interesting about this scene is that he looks identical to Alan, and he mentions that he worked with Scrap. And we know in Alan Wake 2, they collaborated after Alan gave up. During the cutscene when he mentions that they met, there's a cut to a TV. The Night Springs logo briefly flashes on screen, and so does Casper Darling. Note, this also happens later on in Alan Wake 2. Between the in-game collectibles and what we see from Zane in-game, we know without a shadow of a doubt that this here is the real Thomas Zane, not what we see in Alan Wake 1. I actually thought that this wasn't Zane the first time I played through the DLC. He sounded different and he looked identical to Alan. Based off how he acted in this scene and what he talked about, I thought this was... But Zane isn't the only Alan Wake 2 character that we hear or see about in Control. This one is more of a minor point, but it needs to be brought up now. Stop looking ahead of the spiral, we're not there yet. FBI agent Saga&Casey, who shares the same name as the character from Wake's book series, shows up in a few documents. He's requesting information from the FBC about Wake's disappearance in 2010. And as we see in Alan Wake 2, he's basically his literary counterpart and is actively investigating Alan Wake's disappearance. Saga&Casey was a real person whose life was manipulated to become an FBI agent. He is not the Saga&Casey from Wake's books brought into reality. Same thing with Saga Anderson, except there isn't a book series with a character who has the same name and occupation as her. Their lives were manipulated so that they would end up in Bright Falls in 2023. Also that they can play a role in the novel that Wake was writing to escape. During the Nightmare Deerfest at the end of Alan Wake 2, someone talks about a prank that Alan wrote involving a salt shaker. While Saga is losing her mind in final draft mode, it adds that prank as a memory. This is not comfortable. I've already established that time doesn't matter in the dark place. So that's how Alan is able to manipulate the entire lives of two different people so they end up exactly where he needs them to be for the story. While they were out of the dark place's sphere of influence throughout their whole life until they came to Bright Falls. Given enough time, it can change reality outside of that sphere. Like how at the start of the game, everybody in Bright Falls thought Logan was dead, despite that not being true. But by the end of Saga's story, it becomes true. Now, with these two lives manipulated so that they will become FBI agents and become partners who end up working on a case involving Alan Wake in 2023, this is finally the part of the video where I can start giving answers to things like the Anderson brothers, Zane, Darling, and who created Alan Wake. Not in real life, in the video game. The groundwork of the theory has finally been laid. The vast majority of Alan Wake 2 was written by Alan Wake. There are some things that we see that weren't. They're mostly things that happened within the dark place and involve specific characters. I just had to get that out of the way before jumping into the specific details. At the very least, the Anderson brothers know something is happening. At the very most, they know exactly what's happening. And I'm not talking about a specific game here, I'm talking about the entire Remedyverse as a whole. Again, that one line from Control. They seem to be somewhat aware of a story changing reality. Throughout the entire series, whenever they look at Alan Wake, they only see Tom Zane. For reasons that I'll get to later, for now we're sticking with this point. So let's look at how they're able to see past the lies. In 1988, Thor and Odin did battle with, quote, the Dark One. During the event, Odin lost his eye. And I believe they got that ability from this encounter. It's theorized that the Dark One is Warlin Door. But why would he give knowledge to Thor and Odin if all he got out of it was Odin's eye? I believe it was to gain access to Tim Breaker for Quantum Break related reasons. Despite being a character who can jump through the multiverse, maybe Door doesn't have access to him. But the people who he was really helping in 1988 with this act are able to manipulate Alan, so he writes that Tim Breaker ends up in the dark place. While those characters are unable to give the Andersons the knowledge themselves or through Alan. Alan does write about that encounter with the Dark One. I believe it's him adding an existing event into the story. It's also believed that Saga is Door's daughter, so he needed to give the Andersons knowledge so she didn't die, on top of getting access to Tim. And I believe the unused song on the EP, Sea of Night, is about this event. At the very least, there's a line in the song that says that they are being guided by Odin's all-seeing eye. The eye that he lost through that encounter that allows him to see through the lies. And if you know anything about Norse mythology, you know the significance of Odin losing an eye, and probably notice that he is missing the wrong eye. And now it's time to talk about the two mystery men who Mr. Door was helping, who have been manipulating everything behind the scenes. scenes. And if you've been paying attention or looking deeper down the spiral, you probably know who they are. When playing through the game originally, in this scene, I thought Alan was calling Alan on the phone, much like Alan did. And then there were rumors of New Game Plus adding changes, and I started thinking and things started flowing. I had a feeling that we were going to be on the other end of this phone call, but we never were, because he was never talking to himself on the phone. It was the man who sounds like him, Dr. Casper Darling. I saw that somebody posted this meme on Twitter, and it got me thinking about this whole theory, and it just made so much sense. The guy on the phone never identifies himself. If you were in a nightmare dream scenario and you picked up the phone and heard your own voice, you would assume you were talking to yourself, not somebody who just so happens to sound exactly like you. The subtitles don't even say Alan in quotations. They say familiar voice. If it was truly Wake, it would have said so. But they buried the lead, and there's only one guy who sounds like Alan Wake, and whose voice would be familiar to people who played Control. Darling. Remedy is very deliberate with things that they put in their games. If it was Alan, they would have f***ing said so. But wait, hold up, calm down. How do we know that Darling is in the dark place? He would have to be there to call Alan. We do, thanks to Final Draft mode. There were a couple things added to Final Draft that have massive lore implications. What I want to talk about right now are 3 videos from Darling revealing different things. In the first video, he's trapped in the dark place trying to find a way out. And when Alan watches the video, I believe he comments on how Darling sounds like him. The second video is where he meets up with the real Tom Zane. Zane comments on his voice, and Darling comments on his looks. And who do you get when you mix Zane's voice and Darling's looks? Alan Wake. And they decide to do a collab before the video ends. And he also confirms that time doesn't really work down there. In the third one, Darling is in the regular world visiting the lake house, a research facility ran by the FBC on Cauldron Lake. And now I can finally say who created who and who caused everything in this series to happen. Dr. Casper Darling and Thomas Zane, the filmmaker. So we know that Zane and Darling are trapped in the dark place. Zane through similar means as his character in Tom the Poet. Thank you, Samantha, for having those dreams. In fact, I think that movie is the reason why he got trapped in the dark place. Through it, the dark presence killed Barbara and tried to use Zane to escape. Ultimately, it failed because maybe how the movie ends? Who knows? All that really matters is that Zane is in the dark place because of it. For Darling, we don't have a direct answer on how he is in the dark place, but we have enough to figure it out. The third Final Draft video of him takes place before the oldest house goes into lockdown and before Darling disappears. If they were locked down, he wouldn't have been able to re-enter or leave. Darling says he's going to use the research from the lake house to run against Hedron. And in his final message in Control, not Dynamite, his actual final message, he says he's going to fully expose himself to Hedron. I believe doing that after running the lake house data on Hedron, he was sent to the dark place. Now, with both characters trapped in the dark place, they start working together, science and art, to find a way out. Now, this is when the theory gets really fun, and I get to stop power squatting right now. Following the real world's timeline, the first people that they manipulate are the Anderson brothers. They need music to guide the characters they're creating. They manipulate these two from the dark place to make all the songs we hear from them, excluding the ones in Alan Wake 2. That's how they were able to write about the future. Darling and Zane already wrote what was going to happen to Alan and Jesse, and they got the brothers to sing about them. And because time doesn't matter in the dark place, Darling, someone who was in the real world until shortly before the events of Control in 2019, is able to help manipulate the Andersons. And no loops are created as long as he didn't hear the songs beforehand. But as a part of their story, they need the Andersons to see through the lies. And they get help from occasional collaborator Warlin Dorr to take Odin's eye and bless them with knowledge in return. And again, he does it to get to Tim Breaker and to make sure his daughter doesn't die. And with that out of the way, we get to their saviors. The first one being Alan Wake. Zane and Darling made Wake a combination of the two. Maybe he's a character being played by both at the same time, much like with the real life actors that play the character. Zane does the physical performances and Darling voices him. And maybe that's why the Andersons have always called him Tom, because they can see through the lies. They see through the performance. When they look at Wake, they just see Tom Zane. The clicker is a very important item throughout the entire series. It was given to Alan by his mom, you know this, and And that poem in Alan Wake 1 that led to this whole mess to begin with isn't why the clicker's in Alan's life, but I believe the real Tom Zane put the clicker into his life not through that poem, but through other means. But the Dark Place can't create something out of nothing, so he needed to pull the clicker from somewhere. So he got it from a lamp, his angel lamp that we use in Alan Wake 2. How do we know it's his? In that very same game, Cynthia says that it was Tom's.
It had been Tom's lamp, one of the few things that reminded her of him. It had not worked in a long time with the cord severed and the light switch gone. But there are other kinds of lights than the ones we can see. The invisible light of the angel lamp had held Cynthia together all these years.
And going back to that poem in Alan Wake 1, it says that it was his father's. So it's entirely possible that Tom Zane is Alan Wake's biological father. One issue with that, timeline-wise, I believe Alan would have been like -7 when Tom disappeared. So either there's God getting Mary pregnant stuff happening, or it's looking at it from more of an artistic perspective. Darling and Zane did make Wake, so technically they're his dads. Honestly, I've been bouncing back and forth between them manipulating someone to become Alan Wake and them playing the role together. Sadly, we don't have a concrete answer to this yet. I believe we will get one, but right now we can only really theorize on it. There's still a few things about Alan's origin that are up in the air. But do you know whose origin isn't? Jesse's. With Wake made real, they moved on to Jesse. It's a bit harder to connect Jesse to Darling and Zane, at least compared to Alan, who is a combination of the two. Keep in mind, Jesse never meets Darling face to face in Control. But once you remember how I believe Darling ended up in the Dark Place, it makes sense. It was because he exposed himself to Hedron, who is Polaris, the entity living inside of Jesse's head. So he must know who Jesse is. With that knowledge and him possibly still being infected by a little bit of Hedron, Darling was able to influence Jesse through Hedron to go to the oldest house. She only goes there at the start of the game because Polaris told her to.
She's come back. After a long time, she's calling me. In a dream I saw, She showed me things. It felt more real than anything. As real as what happened in Ordinary. Polaris wants me to go to New York. There's a building there. I have to leave soon. I have to be there at a very specific time. Something hugely important is going to happen.
With that direct link to Jesse, it would be so easy for Zane and Darling to influence her whole life. But they can only manipulate anything that happens to her after the Ordinary AWE. She needs to have Polaris inside of her for any changes that they want to happen take effect. Because if Darling only knows about her through that link with Polaris, and he uses that link to make sure the Ordinary AWE happens, we have another loop. And say it with me now, it's not a loop, it's a spiral. With her path set in stone, they have her go to the oldest house, become the new director of the FBC, and clear out the hiss. But it has to happen in a way that doesn't interfere with Darling being trapped in the Dark Place. Another thing to note about Jessie is that she knows who Tom the Poet is. I believe it's because the house she grew up in is the one from the This House of Dreams blog. And when Samantha Wells contacted the previous owner's daughter, I believe that person was Jessie. I don't see why else she would know who Tom the Poet is. I don't know why she needs to know, but it definitely has something to do with Zane and Darling's ultimate plan. And now we can finally get to it now that Wake is trapped in the Dark Place and Jesse is the director of the FBC. Almost every single thing that has happened in the Remedyverse was coordinated by the real Tom Zane and Dr. Casper Darling so they can escape the Dark Place. A wild plan of manipulating so many different people's lives so they end up at the right place at the right time, exactly when they need them to be there. But they can't just say, I want Alan Wake to sound like me and to look like my weirdly jacked friend. Poof! Alan Wake now exists. That's not how the Dark Place works. They need to create some form of art. I see two possibilities of what they could have made. The first and least likely one is that they made a video game called Alan Wake, where Tom did the mocap and the live action segments, and Darling did the voice. They then follow up the cult classic that they released in 2010 with Alan Wake American Nightmare, Control, and Alan Wake 2. More so than any artistic media, I say that video games are a combination of art and science to form an unstoppable force. I think it's super fun to have the characters from the video game we are currently playing make the video game we are currently playing to get out of the dark place. There's one very clear answer to what they're making, and it's not that. I only brought it up because it's a fun theory. What they're making is Night Springs, the TV show. First off, the connections that the characters have to Night Springs. Alan wrote for the show early on in his career. Saga's husband and kid are huge fans of it. In a blog post, Samantha Wells talks about how there's an episode of Night Springs that mirrors what's happening to her. In Alan Wake 1, Sarah Breaker tells Alan that there's an inside joke amongst people in the town that Night Springs is based off of Bright Falls because of all of the weird urban legends that are like Night Springs episodes. If Zane and Darling were making Night Springs in the dark place, and its main area of influence is Bright Falls, a lot of stuff that they put into the show will naturally happen around town. The biggest proof that Night Springs is what they're making is something that happens to the real Tom Zane twice, once in Control and once in Alan Wake 2. When Zane mentions that him and Wake were collaborating, we see a shot of a TV. The Night Springs logo flashes on screen, then Darling is seen. Same thing happens in Alan Wake 2 when we first meet up with Zane, but this time Jesse is also on screen. There are posters all around the dark place advertising a new season of Night Springs. Hell, there's a Night Springs video game in Alan Wake 1, so I might not be that far off with this one. And guess what the first DLC for Alan Wake 2 is called? Night Springs. Where are you? And I am quoting Remedy's website right now. Visions and dreams. Fiction collapses and remains just words on a page. These are those stories in Night Springs. Play as several familiar characters from the world of Alan Wake and experience the unexplainable in multiple self-contained episodes of Night Springs. I'm recording this before we've seen anything from any of the DLCs. All we know about is that blurb I just read from Remedy's website. I bet this DLC is going to be us playing through the stories that Zane and Darling made to manipulate reality. Now, I don't know if we're going to be playing through the actual episodes of Night Springs, or we're going to be playing as the people in the real world experiencing these events. Ultimately, I don't think it matters too much. Personally, I really hope we get a This House of Dreams episode. To continue theorizing about the DLC, I believe the DLC will end with Zane screwing over Darling and abandoning him in the dark place, leading into the Lake House DLC, where you play as somebody from the FBC, either Estevez or Jesse, trying to figure out what happened to the Lake House and Darling on one side of reality, while playing as Darling on the other side. Not much is known about this one. I think it's just you play at the lake house and there's two realities and two characters you play as, much like in the base game. To look beyond the DLC and the future of the Remedyverse, a trademark was recently filed for FBC Firebreak. If it is Control 2, I believe it will follow Jesse using the fire breaks within the oldest house to dimension hop to save Darling. Considering the trademark was just filed and up next for Remedy are the Max Payne remakes, we won't be seeing the Remedyverse again for a good amount of time, unless the Max Payne remakes bring that into the Remedyverse, which would be super interesting because Alex Casey is basically Max Payne, and then we'll get Alan Wake 3, which will be about defeating the real Tom Zane so everybody can finally return. If you couldn't tell, I don't trust Tom Zane that much. He seems like a really shady guy, so I believe he will be the true villain of the series. While the past little bit has been me speculating about the DLC and the future of the Remedyverse, I believe I'm right that at the center of this spiral is Zane and Darling making Night Springs. And after over 13 years, in this center, we finally have an answer as to who made who. Zane and Darling made Wake, but Wake made Tom the Poet in Alan Wake 1. It just makes so much sense that they worked together to create Night Springs and caused everything to happen. They set Jesse on the path to save them. They created Wake. They got the old gods of Asgard to make music to guide them. All of that was the result of them collaborating together so they could escape. New Game Plus establishes that they're trapped in the dark place, among other things. Darling called Wake. They make sure the Anderson brothers can see through the story. They needed the events of Alan Wake 2 2 to happen, so they got Wake to manipulate Saga and Casey so they ended up in Bright Falls in 2023. Control sets up the real Tom Zane, introduces us to Casper Darling, and has the game finished with Jessie becoming the director of the FBC because that's exactly where they need her to be. Time isn't a thing in the Dark Place, so it doesn't really matter that Darling was trapped many years after some of the things they manipulated through Night Springs happened, as long as those things do not lead to him being trapped in the Dark Place. The Andersons didn't make Jessie awake because their music only guides. So Alan Wake wrote everything that happens in the first game. It couldn't have been Tom the Poet because he's a movie character played by the Bright Presence, made real and brought into the story by Alan Wake. So all that the poem did was give the clicker power and bring it to Bright Falls. Which means that the poem Alan finds with the clicker isn't what set him on this path because he wrote in that Tom the Poet wrote the poem. And that's how I spiraled out of control while trying to solve Alan Wake's longest running mystery. To prove that Alan Wake made Tom the Poet, I had to go so far from the scene that started it all, explaining explanations with an explanation for an explanation. And in that spiral, I discovered why and how everything happened. To greatly simplify this whole thing so I can post it on TikTok with Subway Surfers gameplay, Tom the filmmaker and Casper Darling made Alan Wake through Night Springs, who then made Tom the Poet real in 2010. But there is one thing I neglected to mention. How were they so easily able to influence and manipulate the lives of so many people with Night Springs if Alan Wake 2 establishes that it is very difficult to manipulate and influence the lives of people outside of Bright Falls? Thanks to the research from the Lake House, Casper Darling was able to amplify the effects. Hey, editing guy Matt here. There's one thing about my theory that's been bugging me throughout the entire editing process, and I think I finally figured it out. I feel like it's a lot to assume that Darling didn't know anything about the Cauldron Lake AWEs. Even if we assume that nobody from the Bureau ever talked to him about these events, the whiteboard behind him has the names of people involved. There's no way that he stood in front of that for an entire shoot without asking anybody about it, or reading it. With the theory I constructed, he would actively have to ignore that board and everything about those events. He can't know about them if he helped create Night Springs, or else we would have a loop. But I think it's fine if he didn't write any of it. I believe Zane had everything for Night Springs written out before he met Darling. All Darling did was voice Alan, get Jessie to go to the oldest house, and created a machine to amplify the power of the Dark Place for Night Springs. And again, he created it by using the data from the Lake House that was based off of the FBC's experiments, not the data from the AWEs, which I don't think the Lake House would have anyways. I think they started investigating all of this in 2010. Even though all Darling did was make the machine in the theory, the data he used to make the machine can't be based off of something he made as a result of the data. I believe him only amplifying what was already written allows him to know about the AWEs without creating a loop. And this implicates Zane even more, which I'm down for because I still believe he's the main villain. Hell, I'm leaning towards him causing the ordinary AWE at this point. Even though we're not done here yet, I just want to quickly say I would love to hear your thoughts on this whole thing. And if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe. This took a lot to make and I would really appreciate it. That's how the combination of art and science became unstoppable. Like this scene that you can barely see Zane in, that's on me, has the biggest lore implications out of any scene in this whole series. Because it heavily implies that they made Wake, and if you think about it, things start to spiral, and then everything just seems to connect. Even if I'm wrong about all of this, I believe my thought process is on the right track. But there's no f***ing way they didn't make Wake. They literally are him. He's just like us, for real, for real. Alan Wake 2's ending line isn't just a clue to his side of the story, or him realizing how he could survive. I think it's the key to figuring out so many mysteries in the Remedyverse. I believe when you look at this entire series and you're making theories about it, if you encounter circular logic, you are in the wrong place. It is wrong. It can't be true. It's not a loop. It's a spiral.